Hi everyone, welcome to the first devlog of Cubicatch. Cubicatch is an upcoming puzzle game where you play as a cube and your goal is to reach the target cube, and you do this by dashing from block to block until you reach the target. My name is Adam, and in this video we're going to go through 2 years of development in just a few minutes. So bring your choice of beverage and let's get right into it. So everything started when I was playing around in Unity, trying to figure out how this thing worked. And suddenly, I saw a mechanic for a very small puzzle game, where you dash from cube to cube until you reach the target cube. And I'm pretty sure that there exists a name for this mechanic, but I couldn't really find anything online. So if any of you guys know, please let me know in the comments. Anyway, I thought creating this game would be a good starting project for learning Unity. And I thought I could complete this game in just a few weeks and then be done with it. But, well, a wrong estimation to say at least. Nonetheless, I started with the movement to make a playable prototype. I had some problems with the collision though, and I tried something called a rigid body at first. And the gravity aside, it still seemed a bit unstable to use in a grid-based movement mechanic. So what I did instead was this. I shoot a raycast from the player cube in the direction that they want to move, and if we find any block, we can calculate the position that the player should be moved to, and then we could just translate the player to that position. I coded this movement logic and started testing, and surprisingly it worked very well. It was at least more stable anyway. I then continued to create a goal block that changes the level if reached, and this was in order to create some kind of progression in the game. I also created some basic puzzles to test this new feature. And at this stage I had my working prototype of Cubicatch. However, I started quickly to get annoyed on a few things. The first annoyance was that we could not really see the direction that we are pointing at. So I added a simple dotted line that shows this direction. And it changes color depending on if the direction is valid or not. I also felt a bit limited on the level design, because the player could only look at the level from one fixed perspective. So I added a simple camera control that allows the player to rotate and zoom around the level. This made it a lot easier to create levels, because you don't need to really think about blocks obscuring other blocks. However, a problem arose because of this that made the direction controls very confusing. This was because the player direction was absolute. It did not take into account how you look at the level. For example, if I now press right, the direction is correct. But if I turn the camera around to the other side and press right again, it's now instead left from the camera's perspective. So I did some coding and made the direction controls to always be relative to the camera. This made it a lot less confusing for the player. Then I noticed that the collision with the blocks was a bit lackluster. I wanted some more impact on the collision. So I scripted a recoil system where I could determine the recoil using an animation curve. And talking about blocks, I started to get a bit tired on the boring cubes that I currently have. So I started to model some new cubes in Blender. But I had no idea what I was doing at first. But after eating a donut or two, it became a bit more clear. I imported models to Unity, and it did not make a huge change, I would say, but still better than the generic Unity cubes. I also added particles when the collision occurs between blocks, but I was not really happy with the design, so I will probably revisit this later. Now for the background, or so-called the skybox. This needed to be changed. However, this was a lot more difficult than I expected to make it look nice. I tried to add a skybox I found online. However, having a lot of details made the rotation very jarring or intense. Instead, I tested to have a solid color, which was better but very boring. After trying different colors and skyboxes, I ended up with creating my own simple shader that creates a gradient. I think this looked the best of all the alternatives, and I also added some discrete clouds to add some details to the background. I then just continued to improve the visuals of the game. I added some particles in the world and some sun rays. I added post-processing and made the player emit light. I modeled a few trees and made the trees bend when the player collides with the block. I added a pretty cool shader that allows me to add a surface to the block. I also added different season or areas, so winter, spring, summer, and autumn. And finally, I added a new level transition system. I did not want to have any load screens. So instead, I tried to load the level while moving to the next level to create kind of a seamless transition. I also made the level number and name appear behind the level itself during a transition. At this stage, I was fairly happy how the game looked and felt. So I continued to create a few new levels and testing them. But then I got stuck on a level, and I realized that I could not really undo. So, I had two choices here. Either I could require the user to restart the entire level if they get stuck. Perhaps that would be a bit frustrating for the user, so a better option would be to create an undo system. The simplest undo method would be to store the player's position in a list every time the player moves. Then, when the player wants to undo, we pop the first element in the list and move the player to that position. While this might work fine for now, it's not very scalable when wanted to add more feature that needs to be affected by the undo. And for this reason, I implemented the undo mechanic using something very similar to the command pattern. I started to create a singleton with a shared stack that contains all the events. A player event contains just a number of action events that is the reaction of the player's input. I added a function that allows me to add a player event, and another that allows me to undo a player event. And now I can reference this singleton anywhere I want an undo logic. So if we go to the player, we can now add an action event that contains the position and direction data. Then add the player event to the action manager. We can then handle the undo to move the player to the last position stored in the action event. And here we can see how it looks in the game. So, what now? Blocks. At this stage, I wanted to add new blocks with different properties and mechanics into the game. This is because the game in its current state is kind of a maze puzzle game, where you try to find the correct way from point A to point B. And I would say that the gameplay gets boring pretty fast because of this. So I started experimenting with different blocks, and I kind of accidentally created this block, which completely changed the game and added an entirely new dimension to the game. But this block deserves an entirely separate video, so make sure to subscribe to not miss it. I also have a Steam page that might contain some clues what block this is. You can wishlist the game also, which helps me a lot. That is, if you're interested in the game. And I think I will end it at that. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next devlog. Bye.